So, good morning, Brendan. I just want to briefly introduce you to everybody. You are the chair of our scientific advisory board, and you have vast experience in the area of clinical trials, having run clinical trials around the world for big companies as they take an idea out of the lab out to being approved for use. So you are the perfect person for me to chat to today, a little bit about the background, about what it takes to run a clinical trial, what are all the stages. So the first question I had for you this morning was, you hear, be it a vaccine being developed or a new treatment or a new surgical approach or intervention, that they go through multiple phases of clinical trial. And so I hoped you might be able to walk us through what those phases are, what makes them different from each other in terms of the steps it takes to get something approved that's come from some innovative idea or a new compound. What does it take to get it out there? What are the steps it must go through?
The journey that a new medicine takes is usually fairly long and complex. And it starts off in the lab with the scientist having an idea that a particular chemical compound might be useful in modifying a disease. And they'll test that out in laboratory systems like, in isolated cells and stuff like that, cell culture. And eventually, when it's been shown to have enough prospect of working, it may then move into studies in experimental animals like mice and stuff like that. And then if it still looks hopeful, and the majority of candidates don't, they're discarded, but if it still looks hopeful, it will then be thought of as going into human studies. And the first thing that has to happen there is when the study is designed, the investigators have got to get approval from ethics committees and from the regulator in the country in which they're going to do the study. In Ireland, it would be the Health Products Regulatory Authority, HPRA. And they've got to have data protection sign off and stuff like that. So there's a lot of very rigorous protection immediately applied so that volunteers who are involved in the trials are guarded and protected by independent people. So for instance, the ethics committee in UCC, which regulates about 85% of all industry studies done in Ireland, has experts in the disease and has lay experts, has lay people who know about ethics, has people who are expert in law, in insurance, all that kind of stuff, and they all work together to protect the interests of the individual who might be in the study. So when the study gets sign-off, and usually that sign-off is given with a lot of help from these bodies, it goes into what's called a phase 1 exploratory trial. And that might take 30 or 40 people who all volunteer for it and all consent very carefully to it. And the new drug is tried out at the very lowest dose possible. And then you see what happens, and then you get maybe some new people and up the dose, and you gradually escalate the dose in different groups within that 30 or 40 people until you find the dose that's most likely to work while still not causing adverse effects to those people. So that exploratory study, if it's all okay, will be really directed to the immediate safety of people in the study, as well as looking at whether it works and looking at how it's processed in the body. So there's a lot of science goes on, and these are very intensive studies. The next thing then is if it passes that, it goes into a phase 2, early phase exploratory trial in phase 2, but just expanded numbers, but with a more definite dose range. And if it passes that, it then goes into a much bigger study called a phase 3. And phase 3 trials are usually those which will test whether the drug is safe enough and works well enough in the disease to be allowed on the market. So phase 3 studies, for instance, for a cancer drug, you would recruit maybe a couple of hundred people or more, and over perhaps 20 or 30 different sites internationally. And the patients who are recruited into that study are treated in a way which they would be if the drug was on the market, more or less. So what you're doing there is you're treating the people for whom you propose the drug be used in the way it would be used if it were available generally. All of this process is heavily supervised. So the regulatory agency can send inspectors out to all of the clinical sites and make sure that everything is being done properly and that people are sticking precisely to the protocol. And the integrity of that process is preserved very carefully. And there are major international conventions which set out in detail how that's done. Not just setting out the science and the data, but also setting out the rights of the participant. And these are protected all the way along. The ethics committee oversees all that as well. At that stage then, if that study is effective and shows that the drug is of benefit and is safe enough, it'll be presented to the regulatory authorities. Now, you might have to do 4 or 5 of these studies at that stage, but the regulatory authority will receive all of the package of data, starting way back in the lab with the cell cultures and the mice, and going through into the phase 1 and all the way through, so that they see everything that has contributed to the development of this medicine. And they will assess that in the case of Ireland, the European Medicines Agency, on which the Irish HPRA has a major role. The European Medicines Agency will usually assess the data. And then independently, it'll be assessed probably in the United States by the FDA, in the UK nowadays by their own separate agency, and the Australians will do it separately, the Canadians will do it separately. So the drug will be examined quite independently of each other by a whole pile of regulatory agencies around the world, wherever whoever owns the drug wants to put it on the market. And then they'll decide whether to authorize it or not, whether the benefit of being on the drug outweighs any safety risks which are associated with it. So basically, the regulatory agencies balance up the risks and the benefits of the drug and decide which outweighs the other. They're also completely in control of the quality of the medicine as well. So the data that you have to present about how the drug is made, how absolutely consistent it is, and where all its ingredients come from, that relates to the quality of the drug. So the regulatory agency assesses safety, quality, and efficacy. And if these all pass, so they may restrict who it's used in, or they may say, anyone who goes on this drug will have to have the following assessed, the following tests done to see that it's okay, and reported back to the agencies. Now, once you pass that winning post, it's not really the winning post, unfortunately, because the regulator, in our case, the European Medicines Agency, will say it's safe, the quality is great, and the efficacy is proven. Mm-hmm. The question now comes as to whether anyone will pay for it. So people will be familiar of controversies about having drugs made available by the HSE, and there are often campaigns to get the HSE and the Department of Health to allow a drug to be used in Ireland. So that then goes to a completely separate body for reimbursement. So around the world, the fact that it is allowed to be sold doesn't mean that governments have to pay for it.
Okay.
So the reimbursement decision is one then that can often lead to another struggle and campaign for a few years. And Ireland are not good at this. Our availability of drugs for our population is much worse than it should be as a wealthy European country. But it goes through a separate process, essentially, which decides whether the benefit of the drug is worth it for the cost of the treatment. And there we have campaigns and we have persuasion and stuff like that. But it's just so that people know that once the drug is approved by the regulator, it doesn't mean that it's going to be approved by effectively the reimbursement system, by the accountants. So that's a challenge we have. Some drugs are very expensive. So for example, there's a new treatment, a gene therapy for hemophilia, which costs of the order of €1 million per person, but it cures the hemophilia.
Astounding.
But the hemophilia, that person with hemophilia may incur costs of a couple of $100,000 a year. Sorry about that phone call.
That's it.
They may incur costs of perhaps $500,000 a year, just to have their hemophilia treated. And then one very expensive drug just once and it's cured.
Yeah.
And that it's so expensive because there are so few people with that condition in the world.
Yeah.
And those who develop the drug have to make their costs back somehow. And drug development is really expensive. So the clinical trial process that I outlined to you there, it's very difficult to bring a drug to market for an average condition for less than €500 million.
Wow.
And if you add in the cost of failure, so all the drugs that fail and you've spent hundreds of millions on, it's said that a new drug coming to market has cost that drug developer about $2.5 billion.
Unreal.
And people have tried very hard to cut the cost of that, but it's very difficult to do because the manpower is so huge to get it done.
Well, and you also can't really take any of the steps out because of the safety, that they're there to protect the safety of others, and make sure that people understand what they've consented to and all that,
And in the process that I've outlined is usually done stepwise. So take a step, you evaluate it very carefully, and then you decide, do I have another 50 million to take the next step? And the next step after that is bigger and that's going to cost me 200 million. Do I have that?
Yeah.
So normally that means that drugs take 5 to 10 years to develop from scratch. We were able to short circuit that with the vaccine this year because governments made a huge guarantee of underwriting the costs. So all these phases were done in parallel rather than in sequence. And we were able to cut years out of the development cost of the development time of the vaccine without cutting any corners.
So getting down to a little bit more of the technicalities. So when they have something called like a double-blind study, so what does that mean? I mean, I know, but you tell us what that means.
So A clinical trial is basically an experiment to test whether the treatment that you're interested in is as good as or better than an alternative.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a new drug coming up, we want to see whether it's better than whatever is out there. And we want to take all bias away. So you want to take people's preconceptions and their wishful thinking. Everyone wants the new drug to succeed. So there's a huge amount of wishful thinking, and we have to eliminate that. So that's done by a process called blinding.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody is recruited to a study, they're allocated to the new treatment or to the comparator, what was there before. Or instead of the comparator, there might be nothing there before, so you'd use a placebo, a mock treatment, which looks exactly like the real treatment, but you can't distinguish them easily. So that allocation is done randomly. So you can't go in and say, I want the active treatment or I want the placebo.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely randomly assigned, essentially by the toss of a coin in a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't get told whether you're on the new drug or on the comparator or the placebo. As well as that, your doctor, who is the investigator in the trial, doesn't know either.
Mm-hmm.
So their assessment of you is completely objective. They don't know whether you're on the new drug or on the comparator or on placebo or whatever. And that means that their view is unbiased as to whether it works or not. And we then record both whether the drug is working, so whether, it, for example, makes the cancer go away or slows down its development. And we record side effects that people complain of. So people might get colds, or they might get nausea or vomiting or diarrhea or something like that. And all of these are recorded. And at the end of the trial, we'll have a list of all the benefits, and placebo causes benefits as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we'll have a list of all the side effects, and placebo causes side effects. People get colds,
Yeah.
they get nausea, they get diarrhea, they get headache. Yeah. All these things occur, whether they're on the active drug or not. At the very end, the trial is unblinded.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an independent statistician who takes the data and divides it into those who were actively on the drug and those who weren't, who were on the comparator. And those are compared by the statistician. And they're presented to a committee then of investigators who evaluate and assess them. So the unblinding process, again, is done by somebody who is independent and who has no interest in whether the drug works or not. So they'll just show you the objective results. And the study is analyzed then at the end when it's unblinded. Very rarely, if somebody gets a completely unexpected and major side effect,
mm-hmm.
would that person be unblinded? So generally speaking, the treatment of whatever unpleasant things crop up in the course of a trial doesn't depend on whether you know whether it's the active drug or not.
Okay.
But very occasionally, a tiny number, often only 2 or 3 people out of a couple of hundred would be unblinded in the course of the study, mainly to help deal with an illness that has cropped up.
Okay. And so, for cancer patients, 2 things. One is that the concern that they're acting as guinea pigs for things. How would you answer that concern?
Well, ultimately, we'll only be able to develop medicines if we use them in people. So unless we do clinical trials, we will never know whether a new idea objectively will work. So people who participate in trials are really doing so, I think, for two reasons. And they're doing it under this huge protection of the ethics and regulatory and data protection process overseen by these independent bodies. And people do it for two reasons. One is that they just want to make medical progress. They go in because they want to do their fellow man some good. Mm-hmm. And very frequently, I've been involved in many trials. And generally speaking, people tell you the reason they do it is because they want to do good. The second thing in cancer, which is pretty relevant, is that the newest treatments over the past number of years have been more and more likely to work. So when other options have run out for patients with cancer, they very often start looking to see whether they can participate in a trial, because that gives them access to the newest cutting edge treatments potentially. And even if they don't get the active drug, if they get placebo or the comparator treatment, the concentration on their care and the fact that they're being really specialed in their treatment has been shown many times to benefit them. Mm-hmm. So there are hundreds of studies which show that participation in a clinical trial improves your outcomes, no matter what disease you have, but especially in cancer. And for that reason, a lot of people, including myself, would say that the best care in cancer is always given with the thought, would this person be better off if they were in the trial, mm-hmm, with access potentially to a new treatment? So the forum in which patients with cancer's care is discussed in hospitals called multidisciplinary teams. Most multidisciplinary teams in this country, when they're discussing individual patients, the best way to manage them, they will ask the question always, is there a trial that this patient should be in? And I would, because people know that I'm involved in this kind of area, I very frequently get calls from friends of friends or whatever saying, you know, my friend has, is there a trial? Do you know anywhere that there's new treatments being given for this? I'm doing a collaboration at the moment with a friend of mine in MD Anderson in Texas, and they recruit about 50,000 people a year into clinical trials. It's the biggest cancer center in the world. Mm-hmm. And there are people travel from all over the world to them to be in a trial, to have the opportunity to be at the cutting edge of treatment. And of course, you know, we've seen enormous advances, mm-hmm, over the last number of years in lots of previously really difficult cancers. So what starts at the bench with breakthrough and the scientists that we fund, ultimately for that to do anybody any good, it's got to end up in a clinical trial.
Mm-hmm. And thankfully, we have been successful in getting a number of things out into clinical trial, which is one of the things that we're proud of, to see patients actually benefiting from that work. Even though, you know, there can be, as you said earlier, a lot of ones that fail in the early stages, but you have to have all those failures to find the one thing that's going to make it through. I suppose there's also like the idea in Ireland that, like you mentioned there, that if you're participating in a trial, the level of care that you're getting and the level of watch that's on you as you go through, no matter which side you're on, because they don't know, is heightened, and therefore your care is better. but there are also kind of studies that are out there where they show that a hospital that's doing a lot of clinical trials in their hospital, that overall the outcomes for that hospital are better, even if it's not in the same disease area, possibly because it's the ethos of continuously looking for innovation. There's a kind of a research bent to that idea that you're just looking for other things, and I suppose a heightened level of care, you know what I mean? So it's good if your hospital is participating in trials and doing that, because you know that there's a kind of an ethos behind that, and it's proven, you know, like statistically proven that those hospital outcomes are overall better, you know.
Absolutely right. The best hospitals in the world are those that do clinical trials. And undoubtedly, you know, you have to be on your game to do them. And oncologists, you know, we have a fantastic group of oncologists, most of whom are a generation younger than me, or 2 generations younger than me at this stage. And they've all been trained in the best places in the world. If you look at, you know, where they did their postgraduate training, it's a list of the great names of the great cancer centers in the world, and they're all brought up as people who are concentrated and focused on development and of bringing new treatments to their patients, because they know that's the way to do it. And ultimately, you know, there was a very famous patron of breakthrough some years ago, and he said, I asked him, I think, why was he so interested in breakthrough as a major international superstar? And he said, well, I said, I know how to treat cancer in mice. I'm not interested in that. You know, I support people who are interested in curing cancer in humans.
Yeah.
And ultimately, to do that, you got, well, I think you got to do the treatments.
Yeah, yeah. So it's Clinical Trial Awareness Month, which is why we're having this conversation. Is there anything else on the topic that you think people should know? I mean, to encourage people to participate in trials, to encourage researchers maybe to be looking at that as their ultimate endpoint. I mean, their ultimate endpoint is getting their idea out to a treatment that's affecting patients, but the clinical trial is that kind of place where that starts, really.
I would very much encourage people, if the opportunity is there to participate in the trial, to do so. And really not to regard yourself as being a passive guinea pig in this. You know, people who are in clinical trials are doing research. They are making a difference themselves. By participating in the trial, you are really an investigator. You're becoming part of the scientific endeavor which will advance this for mankind. And the legacy that anybody who participates in the trial leaves is a positive legacy, because they enable us to find out whether a drug works and how safe it is. And that directly impacts on the decision to have that drug available for somebody else in the future. We all know people, and I don't think there's a single person in Ireland who doesn't know people who has close friends and family with a serious illness of one kind or another. And the treatment for that effectively has got to come through clinical trials. Mm-hmm. So this is a kind of a sentimental phrase in a sense, but you know, participation in a clinical trial is also a piece, it's a demonstration of love for others as well. You're giving other people things by your efforts in this.
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, people do, like, if you look about the amount of drugs and things that become available in our country, we wouldn't have access to them if they weren't offering them through clinical trial, the costs of some of those. And so the care is better overall if that hospital is able to offer the most cutting edge things that are coming there. As you said earlier, it's not going to be something that's really very untested that's going to get to the point where it's being offered. You know, in the case of cancer drugs, more often than not, once they get to that stage, they have a very high chance of success, and they're promising in some ways. That's why they're being put through those rigors. They wouldn't be there if they didn't people think that patients were going to benefit in some way, you know.
In general, once we're at the stage where drugs are being made available, particularly to our population as a small country, in clinical trials, they've got to a stage where the likelihood of success is pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
And our basic ability to design drugs from the start with the knowledge that there's a high likelihood of them succeeding, that has improved enormously in recent years. We can model so much of this now, and modeling has become a kind of a funny word in recent times with pandemics and stuff, but modeling chemical structures has become a lot more reliable, and that is the beginning of the hope that a new medicine may be developed from an idea.
Yeah. And I suppose when we challenge our own researchers, I mean, you know, obviously through the support of the public, we are giving money to promising ideas and researchers who are trying to find a new treatment for something that, you know, if we can't save everybody in a particular disease, we're trying to find an option to be able to save those. I mean, our thing to them all the time is, like, we're not interested in research for research's sake as a cancer research charity. We're interested in research, development, treatment, or an approach that's going to save somebody's life. And you have to have that endpoint in mind. You know, you have to be as innovative as you can at the beginning, but you need to be looking to somewhere down the line, this has got to help somebody. Otherwise, what's its value to us? Do you know what I mean?
While we start and fund real blue sky research ideas in the lab,
mm-hmm.
we're really very keen on bringing those all the way out to patients. And if you look at what breakthrough funds, we're funding right back to the molecule and right up front to people involved in clinical trials of new medicines and of medical devices as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, we've been very successful. These are, you know, ideas that are working.
And I suppose for those who are listening, it is to say that new things are coming all the time, and it's research is the way that they're delivering. And this clinical trials are a kind of a part of that journey of getting them there. You know, the earlier parts of the pipeline is the research at the bench, but it's, you know, there's new things coming all the time. The pace of that is accelerating. We've even seen it, you know, blown out of the water in terms of a vaccine. I mean, cancer is more complex than that, but you know, there are new things coming. So there's always a lot of hope out there. I suppose resources and time is the only thing that's going to stop us, really. It's not ideas. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
Anyway, well, listen, Brendan, thanks a million for you giving us your time this morning and demystifying some of that process for us, because it can seem scary from the outside to understand, especially when people are worried about, you know, like the independence of it, you know, the double blind fact, the fact that there's no bias, because you're often worried that people so desperately want something to work that they might cut corners or find a way, but all that process is designed to protect against that. And the patients then themselves worry about, you know, if I'm signing up to this, what am I really signing up for? So I appreciate you lifting the lid and showing us a little bit about it.
Pleasure. Right.
All right. Thanks, Brendan. Take care.
Bye.